Hi, Dale. Welcome to Twice Told.
Thank you for having me. A pleasure to be here.
The pleasure is all mine, and thank you for authoring this book. Now, before we start, I'd like to introduce you to the concept behind Twice Told. So, Twice Told is an endeavor where author and reader reconnect about the book, in the sense that you are revisiting this book after having authored it. I am revisiting this book after having read it. The first time that the book was told was when it hit print.
Hmm.
I'm sure you may have had different versions of it in your mind when you started this project. When you embarked on this project, when you visited Iraq and Syria, you had a different version coming in as you were seeing the flow of the rivers. Your editor must have had different ideas about it. Political experience, reality, life, everything may have changed its course. For all you know, I'm playing in the metaphor of the river here.
Yeah.
And eventually, the book came into print, and that's where it was told. I read this
Mhm.
book with my biases and understandings, hopefully more understandings and less biases, and I formed a
I'll
set of
have
impressions.
them.
So now that we're here, sitting across from a virtual table, revisiting this book, so hopefully this book comes out with insights for both of us, and that's how it becomes Twice Told.
Very good. Like that.
Thank you. And thank you so much for authoring this book. My first question would be, how did this book come about and why?
This, uh, I think this is sort of an interesting story. It actually came about through a um, through a teaching assistantship, not with a Middle East historian, but with a historian of the United States, Betsy Blackmar. And I'd been assigned to her course, and I was a little bummed about the fact that I was not going to be a teaching assistant for a course that was more in my intellectual interests. But it was a course on the social history of the American landscape. And one of the books that Betsy assigned was this book by Donald Worster called Rivers of Empire. I think it was published back in like the 1985 or 1986. And it tells Rivers of Empire tells the story of the settlement of the American West through water, through water management and water politics, water law. And it's really a book about it's in its title about aridity, about arid landscapes and how you build kind of build cities, build productive landscapes in an arid area. And of course, I read this book. I had grown up in Colorado, so I was actually quite fascinated by what it was saying about the place that I grew up. And then also then thinking about, how those ideas that Donald Worcester brings up in that text might apply or be, related uh, to the Middle East, to Middle Eastern histories and Middle Eastern landscapes. Um, and the book has, actually, there's Worcester kind of works with the ideas of an economist, Carl Wittfogel, who had this theory of hydraulic empire that he used the history of ancient Mesopotamia as a kind of way of talking about how water management played into politics and into he eventually kind of adopts what I think is kind of a racist formulation of Oriental despotism, and it eventually kind of falls apart, I think, under the weight of that. But what Worcester was trying to do is sort of use that idea and that connection between water and power and political power and economic power to really then talk of to explain the American expansion into the western part of North America. And so I got it into my head like, oh, I should, really kind of think about this in terms of rivers in the Middle East. And I knew of plenty of material on the Nile River, on Egypt, and that people were working on that and had been working on that for years. And My work had been focusing more and more on Syria. That was kind of where my research focus had been heading by the time I arrived in this class, in this teaching assistantship. And so I was like, I should really look at, work on the Tigris and Euphrates and see if, particularly the Euphrates, and see if there's anything that's kind of, Worcester-ish about this, this river. And I went to the library and, really found that there were only certain categories of research on the Euphrates. There was research about transboundary water management. There was research about water security. There was about international law and transboundary water courses. So it was like that sort of stuff. There really wasn't like a modern history of the rivers. And so I went to my advisor, who, first to Richard Bullitt, who wrote some really fascinating environmental histories of the ancient and medieval Middle East. And he was like, "Oh no, like you're wrong. You've missed an entire library. Like go back to the library. Like clearly you've like not found what you need to find." And I'm like, "Oh, okay. Like I guess I guess I messed up." Went back to the libraries, and really, confirmed that like in this particular case, like I was right and my professor was not. That when it came to the 19th and 20th centuries, like there really wasn't a historical treatment of these rivers and their place in society, culture, and politics. And I went back to him 2 weeks later, and he'd actually done his own search because he was interested. And that's really one of the kind of, I'd say, kind of one of the bifurcations in the historiography is that in his in the periods he was interested in ancient medieval times and ancient medieval histories, the rivers had been a real present focus of historians, both in the past and in the near present. And so people were thinking about water and thinking about the rivers in relations to the those societies. But once you got into the more modern period, once you got into the Ottoman period, once you got into the colonial period and the national periods, there just wasn't treatment of the rivers. The rivers were just sort of like there would be a mention of flood, they mentioned some salinization, they mentioned, but it wasn't like there wasn't a historical theory of change that incorporated the rivers. And so that's really where this started. It went from that kind of conversation with an advisor and this hunting through the library, and this book about the American West, into a project that then, ended up taking, a decade and a half, almost to go from kind of that kernel of an idea, to the actual published text.
Understood. Now, based on what you just explained, how much of your reading was divided between historiography, history, and administrative text? I'm pretty sure that speaking about the late 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, you may have had to read civil engineering documents and project plans, 5-year plans, government plans. How were you able to obtain access to these documents, given that many of them may be kept within government lock and key, and they wouldn't be interested in opening up this up to you because there's also the object of scrutiny. Governments could be scrutinized about project expenditure and why did they choose to make this decision. So how did you navigate that?
That's a good question. One of the things that's really helpful, it's not helpful to the states themselves, to the governments themselves, but it's helpful to the researcher, is that most of the projects undertaken on the rivers required external financial assistance, external technical assistance. And so I would end up, when my research began, I was able to access archives in Syria. Iraq was still you know too conflictual of a situation for me to go there, and eventually Syria, of course, became that way as well. Um, but to your point, I actually visited the Assad Library in Damascus before the civil war, and what's interesting about that library is that they have like they had some books and they had some like a very curated card catalog. And that's how you could like access, information. But while I was there, I noticed that they had some computer terminals that were just sort of, sitting out in the main reading area. And I was struggling to kind of find any keywords that really mattered to me. Nothing about the Tabqa Dam, nothing about the Euphrates Dam, very little even about the Euphrates River. And then I went over to like sit at one of the terminals, and you should have just, if you were, viewing the library from above, you would have just seen like, three librarians, running toward me to like get me off of that computer terminal because it was only people, only librarians were allowed to actually use the computers. And it was because about, exactly what you suggested, which is the control of that information, that they didn't want people. It was the least research-oriented library I have ever, been in, where clearly they had a lot of materials, but, they were very restrictive about what people could actually see. And so most of the engineering documents, really with the exception of Turkey, the Turkish government has more available. Most of those kinds of technical documents, engineering documents, feasibility studies, etc., came from effectively what we would refer to as imperial archives. So they're coming out of the Bureau of Reclamation Archives in the United States. The national a set of different national archives and Library of Civil Engineering in London. For Iraq, uh, I was just lucky in a sense that there was a coup in Iraq during World War II, and some of the documents from the British Embassy had been brought to India. And so India actually has some really interesting archives about Iraq, surprisingly. And then French archives for Syria allowed me to see some things, both during the colonial period, both during the time that you would imagine, like during the Mandate period, but also because into the 70s, 80s, 90s, there's good material there because of international organizations, the Food and Agriculture Organization, UN, World Bank. These organizations, many of which are headquartered in these, former imperial or current, I don't even know if you want to use the word former, but like within these kinds of imperial powers, still have these organizations and then have archives. So there's even though the violence and the rise of the Islamic State in both Syria and Turkey really complicated this project, changed it in various ways, I still found a good deal of material in these other locations.
Understood. Understood. Now, how did you navigate your course given that you may have encountered partial information, entirely missing chapters, especially if you're talking about civil studies or feasibility studies, and some information which may have been withheld for obvious political reasons. So, how did you navigate this to get this information out?
Yeah, so I think that I mean one thing was a change of ambition and a change of kind of the lens. One of the things I loved about the model of Donald Worster's work is that it really is trying to tell a kind of social and cultural story. In some ways, a kind of history from the irrigation ditch, type of story that I think is, you know, um, really admirable and also like so desperately needed. Um, that with the closure of, my ability to go to Iraq and Syria, the project had to become a different kind of project and had to look at things in a different way. And so, rather than what I would call a kind of social and a social or cultural history of the environment, which is, I think, what I was sort of aiming for at the beginning of the process, um, the 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 kinds of materials that I was able to collect then shaped, as they should, the kind of story that I was able to tell that I'm not, coming at this. So you have certain kinds of evidence, right? And you have to, approach it that way. And so the scale of the book is fairly different than what I imagined at the beginning. Um, it does move across scales as much as possible, and so I think you get sort of a sense of everything down to sort of the movement of salt molecules, to the like, the history of the city of Baghdad, to then these broader kind of like Cold War alliances and that sort of thing. So it's still trying to do that kind of broader kind of scalar work, but it's the kinds of um, the book in a sense is at a certain point, I realized that the characters I was able to most clearly articulate were the rivers themselves. Like I wasn't going to be able necessarily to sort of dive in to like what was happening in El Tabqa, like with the building of the dam. Like that kind of like granular, almost ethnographic detail was not something I could do. But I could through like all these scientific and engineering studies, and then all of this cultural production around the rivers themselves, I was actually able to kind of start conceiving of the rivers and their ecologies. And because of that, those rivers, the two rivers actually are, in a sense, in my mind, the main characters of the book. The book doesn't really it has human characters, of course, in it, in various places, and I'd say there's like one that really you get sort of a full biography and everything. But really, the main characters are the rivers, and that's really how inaccessibility, in a sense turned inaccessibility into an opportunity to kind of tell a different kind of story.
Understood. Is it fair to say that the rivers then shaped the way that they wanted their stories to be told through you? You had a different idea in mind, but clearly then the rivers decided, I'm going to navigate this differently.
Yeah, I mean, they kept. I mean, it's funny to write, and I think this is not really a criticism of environmental history, but it is sort of a reality of how environmental um, historical methodologies have worked. Is that they've focused pretty heavily still on the human, right? Like they're still kind of very interested in human actors, human activities, and then they tell those activities within this context of the natural world. Um, and because of the sources, and I think really because of what I was seeing in terms of how these ecologies, like the kinds of ecologies that the rivers create, and their shaping of the landscape, it became harder and harder for me to tell these stories um, from kind of like what we would consider like again that kind of social or cultural perspective as like the foreground, and and ultimately wanted to actually switch what the historiography had been doing up to that point, which was I wanted to take the rivers from the background and make them the foreground, and they made it easy for me in a sense because of the fact that the Tigris and Euphrates are not like your sort of they're not the what I would call the kind of like friendliest rivers. In Middle Eastern historiography, the Tigris and Euphrates are the like they're like perpetually in their terrible twos, or something like that. They're the Nile is referred to as this kind of very friendly river that floods at the right time and has plenty of water, and is has a regime that is much more geared toward human settlement. And the Tigris and Euphrates are very kind of capricious rivers that flood very quickly. They flood massively. They flood at very different times of year, depending on the year. And then in the summer, they become almost like trickles. They become, they become creeks in a sense. They and that regime, of course, has changed because of the dams and that sort of thing. But they're you know over the kind of longue durée, they've been these very very difficult rivers in a sense, and the ecologies are complex. And that actually helped with early human settlement and with early agriculture. But as time went on and people's expectations for what a river should be and do within a modern nation state, they became less and less sort of hospitable to those kinds of projects.
Understood. This last paragraph that you said spoke about capricious and mercurial nature of the rivers.
Hmm.
I think that itself deserves a book on the
Mm-hmm.
evolution of human
Yeah.
theology, of our
Hmm.
human view of gods, beginning as capricious and fickle-minded to now more and more seemingly irrelevant as science and technology progresses, and we believe
Hmm.
that we are in control of the situation, and then we enter climate change. But that's a subject
Right.
for some other time. Now,
Yes.
moving back to
Another book,
the
perhaps, but it's a great
exactly,
idea.
yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Now, coming back to your study, so what was the oldest settlement that you had encountered along the banks of the two rivers?
Yeah, so this is a good question for probably a historian. I can talk a little bit about this, but a historian of the ancient world would, of course, probably give you far more detail about this. I think what's interesting about the rivers is they're really the place where we see some of the first human cities. Um, and so the we can go back to kind of 10,000 BCE and start to see kind of the Neolithic revolution starting to take shape in southern Mesopotamia. And then you get some of the first cities around 6,000 BCE, Eridu being kind of the one that most people can point to as one of the earliest cities. And and that I think is really, if we think about the fact that it was only in the 20th century, late 20th century, that the sort of proportion of the human population in urban areas became larger than the proportion in rural and agricultural areas. We're talking about a 12,000 year transformation that began with like Eridu as this kind of invention, like the invention of the city in a sense, that happens in southern Mesopotamia. And it happens for there's a debates about like why this happens, but the rivers are absolutely critical to how the city takes place. And if you start to kind of then think about your favorite cities, many of them are situated along rivers for all kinds of reasons, whether it's navigation, whether it's trade, whether it's food, whether it's just water itself, of course, is absolutely critical, fresh water. Um, and it was no different really in southern Mesopotamia that the river itself provided for all of these aspects. And then of course one thing we should just probably distinguish for folks is that there's a lower basin, right? There's a southern Mesopotamia below where Baghdad is currently, that has one kind of ecology, kind of the delta ecology of the rivers, and then in the northern part, which also had ancient, very old settlements, most more agriculturally oriented. So cities came a little bit later in the northern part of the basin than in the southern part of the basin. But we're talking about one of the longest recorded histories, anywhere. I mean, China and India can give Mesopotamia a run for their money, I think, in those in those ways. But we're looking at, a very long history of settlement and of cities, and this relationship to the river.
Understood. In the course of your research, did you encounter any instances where people either worshipped the rivers or spoke about them in benevolent or malevolent terms in perhaps poetry and prose?
Yeah, so what's interesting, you can go back to the ancient Mesopotamian literature and you'll find the rivers appearing in both ways as life-giving and as destructive or malevolence might be too strong of a word, but the and that's really mirrored in the 20th century literature, like the kinds of ways that I saw a real transformation of the rivers in literature and poetry in relation to dam construction, where the portrayals moved from a kind of life-giving and this is part of our kind of like I don't want to use natural as sort of an overused word, but like a more kind of maybe symbiotic relationship with the rivers to a more kind of like these rivers are a problem and like they're a problem that we can fix with engineering. That's going to be the difference with the ancient Mesopotamian literature, where it would seem from in older these kind of ancient texts, there's far less of an idea that humans have any kind of like control over it, and the stories are not being told. They're being told to explain life, right? They're being told to explain the ebbs and flows of fate, let's say. But later the stories are really being told as a way to justify massive re-engineering of the environment. But it's interesting that they actually kind of have similar flavor to them. They just have a different point, a different outcome in mind.
Understood. Understood. Now, I encountered new materialism in
Hmm.
in your book for the first time. And could you tell us about what is this new materialism? And is this a new way of or a prism through which you saw your scope of study?
Yeah, so new materialism is really interesting, and uh, I think one of the things that's hard about new materialism is to really fully express what's new about it, right? Like, why is it called new materialism? The So new materialism as a project is a response across disciplines. So you're going to find new materialism happening in anthropology, in literary studies, in sociology, in history. Um, and what it is really a response to an earlier response that was a response to old materialism. So, in the way that sort of these waves of kind of like the way like predominant ways of thinking have shaped academic and intellectual work. So you have an older materialism that really is represented by Donald Worster's book and by the social history of the 1960s and 1970s that is much more interested in economic structures, is going to be deploying quantitative data, is going to be thinking in terms of like Marxist materialist theories. That then there's a response to that kind of predominant way of thinking called the cultural turn, which then is really focused on language and on meaning and and it's called the cultural turn because things are now being seen with a cultural lens. And really important stuff comes out of the cultural turn, like post-colonial studies is part of the cultural turn, and postmodernism, like are all these kinds of intellectual threads that kind of add up to the cultural turn. And that's of course that really is 80s to let's say early 2000s, um, and it's it's clearly like a powerful way of thinking about the world and about human minds and change, and we get these great studies of identity and of new kind of concepts of governance and fascinating ideas in linguistics. I mean, it's really like I don't want to say that new materialism isn't replacing something that like was really worthwhile, right? That was a worthwhile shift in our thinking about the world and about change. New materialism comes in as a way to say, okay, like yes, language and meaning and these things are all really important, but we've kind of lost our ability to talk about these material factors and material structures that we know are influencing um, uh, are influencing life that are, particularly with the greater awareness of climate change, where there's actually, yes, there's a structure to these ecologies that's being, a sort of an overarching structure that's going to be affecting, all of these different places. Yes, in different ways, they're going to have different meanings associated with them, but we need ways of talking about material change that have been sort of some of them have been debunked, some of them have been lost as a result of the cultural turn. And so new materialism is an attempt to really kind of bring forward um, and even kind of re-articulate or articulate anew approaches to thinking about material factors, whether we're talking about non-humans like animals, whether we're talking about rivers, whether we're talking about rocks, these sorts of factors that we know are part of our physical material world, and but not lose the kind of cultural and social fidelity of the cultural term. And so I think it's a really good project for the 21st century in a sense that we need to kind of reintegrate um, an awareness of environment, ecology, material processes um, into and become aware of how they are influencing society and culture so that we don't sort of just fall into the modern conceit that these things like don't matter and that we've sort of mastered them and now we can just sort of like inhabit our own minds or this other mind that we've created right with AI and that none of the sort of like none of the rest of the world and its kind of material factors it really matters and so that's really what I think there's so many threads to new materialism but that's I think the sort of larger overarching project or the way that I understand it.
Understood. So, based on what I'd read about new materialism in your book and what you've just explained, and further to the point you'd made earlier about early and late 20th century, where politicians and engineers decided this is a technical problem and we are here to solve it. So, new
Mhm.
materialism attempts to put in this reckoning or understanding for us that these material factors, be it rivers and ecologies, have in almost as if they have a form of sentience and they can influence their own course and the courses of our lives and so many
Mhm.
others as well.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, there's a real spectrum of folks who, on the level of whether of how you describe this agency, right? Um, and it's interesting to delve into these kinds of questions. There's new work on animal intelligence, on the way forests, trees communicate with one another. That I think are starting to overturn or at least like complicate the ways that we would typically narrate the past. And I will tend personally, you know, I think it's easy to kind of like end up in this sort of like being charged with animism or anthropomorphication, with these sorts of things where, I'm not sure that the world is or the world of Western academia, I should say, is ready to kind of contend with some of these findings in kind of a real way. That it's still going to seem perhaps like um, we're talking more theology than we are talking academic history. I would hope that there's these I do hope that these kinds of you know factors kind of break down because I think that both in religious studies and in indigenous studies there's some really good work and convincing work happening that is breaking this sort of stuff down. In my own work, I really sort of think of the rivers and ecologies um, as actors, that they are acting, that they are forces and limiters on sort of human consciousness and human intentions. Uh, that that I tend to shy away from thinking that they have minds. I sort of think of them as these deeply integrated and complex processes that we are capable of we actually are capable of understanding them but we have over time understood them in very particular ways and those ways have led us to certain kinds of actions And so these are connected or even maybe co-constitutive, that what we learn shapes what we imagine, what we imagine shapes what we actually want to learn. And and then uh, you end up with these interventions in the environment that really sort of after the fact don't make any real sense. Like why would we intensify agriculture in these ways in southern Iraq when, it's been known for even the Sumerians knew, that there was a problem of salinization. So, there's these kinds of um, there's of course studies of knowledge production, how knowledge works, and whose knowledge gets ignored. And those I think are quite important. But I also think that my book really is about all the ways that the rivers act outside of a kind of human rubric. Like there's this idea of this is what needs to happen. This is how you build a nation state. This is how you build an empire. This is, and the rivers they're not participating in that, and often they're like an active limiter or active force upsetting those kinds of plans, not because they want to, but because that's how they work.
Understood. Now, reading your book, now that you spoke about new materialism, it makes so much sense. All of it adds up. Is that you see ancient civilizations which were rooted in the material reality, they knew how to coexist with the rivers, or at least we assume so. And
Mhm.
yet, the rivers, of course, changed course and cities had to be relocated. But the colonial chapters, especially in Iraq and Syria, you see under British mandated Iraq, plans to develop southern Iraq, where you mentioned that even the Sumerians knew better not to invest efforts. And yet
Mhm.
we have the British authorities developing agricultural projects and setting out townships over there. But why is it that this entire body of local and very practical knowledge was just cast away, and instead empirical methods which may have worked elsewhere, of course, the authorities may have imagined that empirical methods are standard and can be applied everywhere, but clearly they
Mhm.
were rooted in material reality that just
Mhm.
went for a toss.
Yeah, I mean it's fascinating, and it's one of those uh I'm not sure it's like a I'm not sure it's the most satisfying story in the sense, but it's very human. Like I will say that. Like I think that it's so in the case of Iraq, what we see particularly in the it's a kind of a different story in the 20s, which we can kind of get into. But really when Iraq obtains the financial resources through oil exploitation to enact its own waterworks, it ends up in this position of needing, by virtue of its political situation, to act quickly. Um, and it also doesn't, because of, again, the way that the state had worked up to that point, the state's investing in engineering knowledge and in educating its citizens, and there are Iraqi engineers who are involved, but the but the state has, just as it had earlier in its history, was pulling expertise from other places, particularly from India. Um, and um, and those individuals, whether we're talking about William Wilcox in the 1910s or we're talking about Frank Fraser High in the 1950s, both of whom were trained in India, they are coming at these rivers with that kind of experience and with a kind of British Indian education and engineering education, an experience that just didn't translate, partly because it's a different environment. It didn't translate partly because there just wasn't the same amount of study that had taken place on the Tigris and Euphrates as had taken place on the Indus, for instance. And so the and what's funny about this, and again, the reason I think it's very human, is that those plans were like roundly critiqued. They went through a bureaucratic and political process where they were roundly critiqued, and then they were implemented anyway. And part of it was that and you probably have experienced this in your own careers in any kind of situation where you're working with other people that you'll have a plan. That plan will get torn apart, and then someone realizes they really need to do something, and the only plan they have is the one that has been put through the meat grinder, but has never been revised. No one took the time to revise it, and really kind of think about like what and grapple, with the kind of specificities of that had been brought up in the critique process, and that's what ends up really in happening in Iraq is that the government the government obtains a kind of stability under Prime Minister Nuri Said. There's all this sort of geopolitical stuff happening both in negotiations with Britain about a new treaty and in Palestine. And the government's like, we need to show that we're able to make progress. And what plan do they pick up? But the one that had been, earlier critiqued and discarded, and one that really wasn't suited for the long term. And I should say too that we've kind of have picked out Sumer as an example of a place where people adapted, and they did, but there's archaeological records that suggest that Hellenization brought down the Sumerian civilization too. So there's been this kind of back and forth, I think, if we take a really long view of human communities trying, to function in balance with the rivers, and then really kind of failing in that effort. Sumer, of course, lasted a lot longer than Iraq as a nation state has lasted thus far. We're talking, centuries versus 1 century. But and so it remains to be told sort of what how the balance will be kind of, or I should say the imbalance right now will be corrected, or whether it will be corrected. Uh, but I think again, I wish there's not really a villain in this story except for a kind of like desire and and like what we know of bureaucracy, in a sense that led to this, which again is sort of when you think about the consequences, um, is disheartening, I guess, might be one way of putting it.
You're absolutely right that there are no villains in this book, and
Mhm.
this book would stand out for anyone who is worked in a corporate setting, especially in
Mhm.
planning and project executions. You always have these plans which go through the meat grinder, then are shelved for some reason because we know that they're not feasible. But years, sometimes decades later, that same idea gets picked off the shelf, and because the people who had decided this project wasn't worth doing are either have left the organization or have
Mhm.
now retired, the other folks are like,
Mhm.
hey, why didn't we do this? But there's a
Right.
reason why this has gone through the meat grinder.
Right. This is
And
on the
here,
shelf for a reason. Right.
and then you have
We,
this, and then folly just plays out so
yeah.
badly. So is this an example where we learn this? Maybe is fragility the right word to use, or perhaps evanescence, that some places are just meant not to be settled in permanence? That learning from the Sumerians, perhaps attempting desalinization of the Tigris and Euphrates is a futile exercise. Maybe we should just learn to exist lightly, have a light touch population over there, not intensify agriculture, and perhaps look at other sources of income, given that Iraq has rich oil deposits.
Hmm. Yeah, so I think the there's some good writing by Diana Davis that kind of tackles this question of like how do we conceive of arid lands, and And I think what is sort of tied up in here is this question of ultimately, I think it's a question of how we imagine like the modern nation state and of like modern society. I think that's the kind of the crux of the issue because if you look back at Iraq's history and you look at Baghdad, I mean Baghdad was a huge city for its day, and it's a fascinating city because it was basically designed to flood. Like they knew it was going to happen, and so they just designed the city so that when it flooded, like people would survive and then they would rebuild. And so this idea, I think it's the question of what we mean by permanence, and how we imagine um, agriculture working. And the strange thing about uh, it's not strange as much as it's sort of like understandable in the way that history is unfolded. But the early cities in Iraq were positioned in such a way as to take advantage of multiple ecologies. So the city would be located in an area where it could take advantage of the marshes and all the resources of the marshes, both food and reeds for building and that sort of thing. And then, but it wouldn't be like right in the middle of the marshes. It would be on the edge of the marshes. So it would also take advantage of animal husbandry in nomadic communities, it would be near other kinds of sort of land-based resources. And so you ended up in a situation where if the water was low and the marshes were low, then you could rely upon a different ecology. If the river flooded, you were on the edge, and therefore you weren't like completely in the middle of it. There was a kind of adaptability that was built into the system. And I think that one of the things that we know, that's where this idea of sustainability comes from, is that the modern conception of cities and of modern agriculture and of modern food systems, etc., is not designed around these ideas, or very, very frequently is not designed with a kind of adaptability and sustainability in mind. It is designed with the idea of like intensification and control. And those are the principles under which they are designed. Arid landscapes like Iraq, are the places where those ideas, I think, go to die, essentially, where they it's not about like that these are unproductive lands or that they are uninhabitable or like no one should live there or anything like that. It's that the ideas of intensification and control that were born in other ecologies and that seem to work, although we now know that they don't, right, or that they need to change. That those ideas about how to live and how to build and how to feed a population are not the right ideas for a place like Iraq, let's say. Iraq needs a different kind of system, but the system that was implemented was the one that was based on these other ideas. So I wouldn't say that, Iraq can't be permanently settled. It's clearly like the place where permanent settlement began. Um, but um, the ideas that are animating, um, you know, uh, uh, you know, the construction of cities and agricultural systems and those sorts of things they need to be readapted. They need to be rethought. And one of the cool things to think about, if we think that way, is that Iraq could become the place where those ideas are formulated and put to the test. That Iraq has all kinds of problems. So I don't want to sort of ignore those. But if we kind of are able to leap beyond those to think about these questions of sustainability and adaptation and how you kind of rethink these, then I think Iraq could become a really interesting place for teaching the rest of the world about a different way of conceiving of living. The problem I see just in right up front is that intensification and control has also produced forms of power And those forms of power have been exerted on Iraq time and time again across the 20th century. And so, one of the reasons why it's hard to imagine Iraq becoming this kind of place is because those places that have benefited from intensification, extraction, and control have, time and time again, uh, wanted to control Iraq, through invasion and bombing and everything else.
You have hit a fascinating point here, Dal. With intensification and control, I now speaking to you, this thought just occurred to me is that
Hmm.
intensification and control is such an 18th or 17th century idea, and we are the
Hmm.
21st century.
Hmm.
Clearly, the time has passed for this idea. Now, in combination with aridification or existing aridity of landscapes, this prototype clearly cannot work here. What may work along the banks of the Indus or the Nile with a sustained supply of fertile soil and stable water table is
Hmm.
not the prototype to be applied over here. And now in Lo- now, with the kind of aridification that climate change is causing, this should be a clarion call for urban planners, architects, and city planners and governments to to think about how is it that we can possibly look at lessons from the old or develop ex nihilo new methods for how do we exist in these kind of landscapes with perhaps a light touch where we
Hmm.
don't look at intense extraction, because with intense extraction in as you've detailed in the book, not only do you get soil, not only do you get water, but you also get salinity, and which
Hmm.
eventually will render everything useless.
Hmm. Right. Yeah, and I think that, I mean, there are there are projects in the Gulf that, are imagining this. I think what's interesting here is that we seem to end up sometimes in a binary where either we're going to apply like large scale engineering and tech, or we're going to go back to the old ways. And I really think that like the effort should be kind of more about synthesis. So there's a project in Abu Dhabi called El Masdar City, where they've tried this again. It's it's a weird thing. It's sort of like it's very Oasis like, where it's Oasis kind of in terms of its both its construction and in terms of like the way that it seems to have like influenced anything else. It seems to have just sort of like remained its own little thing that it's not actually going to get implemented outward. But it is these are examples. So Muster, for instance, is this kind of technologically sophisticated place with water recycling and a different kind of transportation system that also then uses courtyards and the sort of wind catching towers to funnel air into the city so that you don't have to use as much air conditioning and that sort of thing. So it's thinking through like how do we, how do we adapt to this environment? How do we have much less of an impact? How do we, you know, uh, uh, provide comfort at the same time that we're like not trying to just sort of like close ourselves off from the world, which is often what air conditioning and modern buildings do. And so that's great. It's great, but it is like it's this like little spot, in a city that, on the other hand, is designed in a completely different way with a completely different logic, and that I think, both points us to the fact that like we can integrate these older methods and ideas and philosophies with modern technology, but that modern technology and the ways that we do that need to be oriented toward a different like goal, a different end. And a lot of times the problem is that end is sustainable, self-sufficient, um, perhaps even like democratic in these kinds of interesting ways, that are not suitable for the kind of political ends that are often sought through construction and engineering. And that's also the kind of like, um, again, why I sometimes think of Iraq um, as the hopeful version of the suffering of the Iraqi people over the past, multiple decades. How glorious would it be for that place to be the place where we finally come to terms with how like national ideals and imperial projects have led to this, destruction of the environment, and then come up with a new way of thinking about the future. That would be pretty amazing. Again, I know it's a very high hope, but we need to have high hopes, I think, to confront what's coming.
I love how our conversations organically segueing from history into the course of the rivers and resource
Hmm.
extraction and now people. I was gonna,
Hmm.
my next question was going to be about people and people's stories in this landscape. So, could
Hmm.
you tell us about what kind of stories, poems, works of
Hmm.
fiction that you encountered where people's everyday lives were altered, not just by the course of these rivers, but by the course of these rivers being dammed and the political chaos or political interregnum that ensued?
Hmm. Yeah, so the book really tries to find its way into everyday life through poetry and literature, but particularly poetry. And the reason for that partly is that I just like poetry in Turkish and Arabic, and Turkish and Arabic have uh, a serious commitment to poetry as an art form. Um, and so that's one reason for why it's in the book. The other reason I think is that poetry is, um, as an art form, is deeply evocative of a kind of moment to moment perception or engagement with the natural world. So if you think of, some of your favorite poetry, uh, you know, it's hard to imagine a poem that's not about or that is not related or using metaphorical language related to nature. Like it's just almost impossible for me to think of a favorite poem that doesn't do that. And so it's methodologically and kind of like personally important to me that poetry is in the text. Um, and then it gives an opportunity to really think through how people reacted to environmental change. So the first part of the book has a good deal of poetry about flooding, and what it was like to sort of live through these disasters for human communities. And then the second half of the book works with novels, film, and poetry related to the building of dams. And we're able to use, I think, these, part of the reason I'm using these kinds of work is because they are available to me. So they were the things that were accessible. I wasn't able to do kind of in situ ethnographic work. And so instead, or oral history, for instance, like those things were kind of, impossible for me to do. But I could find collections of poetry, film, and novels to read that then could give me a view into the meaning that people had made basically out of their situation, and what was happening in the world around them. And so um, the book spends a good deal of time interpreting these features, trying to show uh, how cultural, really, the argument is that cultural production around these uh, rivers is as important as the kind of technical work that the engineers are doing, because this is sort of shaping not merely the sort of justification, but how we understand and the kinds of like goals and visions for the rivers. And so we really see in the Turkish case how a shifting I sort of divide that chapter into that there's a poetic engineering of the river, where the river's cultural meanings are being changed to make the environmental engineering more understandable. And then in the case of Syria, really thinking about the novels and films as a form of resistance to the way that the state wants the dam to be interpreted. And in those ways, we're able to, I think, to really see more of the kind of cultural and social texture around these projects, and also the kinds of interpretations of politics and society that emerge from engagement with the main characters, with the rivers.
Understood. Now, did you find the dam to be a metaphor for dictatorship or strongman governments in these regions?
Yeah, so it's that's a really interesting question. I think that there's a I think that the it's a very interesting question. You've stumped me for a moment. What I think the way I think about the dams is that and I really think that the dams are only part of it. Actually, the fourth chapter of the book is about reservoirs, and I think the reservoir is almost the metaphor that I um, am working with more even than the dams themselves, and that's because the reservoirs are actually the larger impact on the environment, on the ecology of the area. Um, they wouldn't exist without the dams, but the reservoir itself is the thing that's like swamping the landscape. Um, and and in that, I have tended to kind of think of the reservoirs as being not only reservoirs of water, but also reservoirs of meaning and of vision and ultimately of like change. And so in some ways they are they're holding a kind of multiplicity of meaning, like they're holding a multiplicity of water molecules, they're holding a multiplicity of these meanings, and one of them I think is this like authoritarian centralization of like ecological resource, and I use the word resource in this kind of, in a sense of it is, we think of nature as resources when we want to extract, right? And that's what they hold. They also hold, and I talk about this with the dams, that they are also holding time in a sense, that like they hold a kind of um, for the people who remember what the landscape was before, there's a kind of, temporal component to them. And then the way that we write about dams and reservoirs is in this kind of static, like the dam was built, at this time sort of way, and now it is like this. And sometimes we even naturalize it, right? We call the reservoirs lakes, even though they're not natural lakes. And our language kind of gets fuzzy around it, which I think again points to the multiplicity of meaning that's involved. And so, in the sense that they are a kind of representation of an authoritarian or centralized kind of form of control, then yes, they work in that way. But I think that the artists, particularly the Syrian artists who came later, have then turned those meanings on their head and suggested that these are sites of resistance, they're sites of overreach. They never, almost all these projects, very few of them ever delivered the things that were promised. And so they also become and in the case of Syria, very, very, again, this kind of connection between material and culture, they become very materially and culturally like sites of failure, and sites of state failure in particular. And so when the Islamic State took over the Tabqa Dam, there is this sense of like, okay, this representation of the Syrian state as this kind of powerful revolutionary state now is like obliterated, but then the Islamic State needs the dam in order to prove itself as a state, and so if the Islamic State can take it and make it work, right, can make it become something that it wasn't under the Syrian government, which again is ridiculous, right, because you're still dealing with the same facility, the same parameters, then somehow it can become some other kind of symbol, even if it's still a symbol of statehood. It's still a symbol of like state capacity. And so, um, that's a long-winded answer to sort of give a categorical yes to that question. But I think part of the idea of the book is that these places are multifaceted, and that we have to kind of deal with it's not only accumulated water, but it's accumulated meaning that goes along with it.
That's an amazing answer. Of course, there can't be a straightforward black and white answer to a question like this. Now, as you were
Mhm.
speaking, I was visualizing Gilgamesh holding a
Mm.
lion in his embrace. It would have been much more fitting if it was a tiger. It would be a very direct,
Right, right, exactly.
a very direct impression of reservoirs and dams.
Mm.
But for me, what's more telling is Gilgamesh wanted to live forever, but even he realized that power has its limits, and at
Mhm.
some point you have to learn to let go.
Mhm. Right. Yeah. I mean, I really don't think that I don't think these dams are quite right, basically. I think that's, really expressed through the last half of the book, that the premises upon which they were founded and built, the the way that they reshape the landscape, um, and we know this of megadams. We know this of megadams in other parts of the world. Those same lessons apply here, and perhaps have just not been told as clearly as they need to be. That um, you know these. I don't think that sort of philosophically and sort of in terms of our kind of ecological being ecologically minded, that they're necessarily going to be taken down for those reasons. They're probably actually going to be taken down by the fact there's not going to be any water in them. And that's really the kind of like outcome of this. Um, and and one would then sort of like hope that we would be thinking carefully about um, alternatives, alternative technologies, alternative ways of producing energy, that would in fact help us again adapt to these kind of new realities. But I think it helps really to be thinking not only about these the kinds of stories that we tell, like the way you narrated Gilgamesh there, is quite elegant and informative. And that I think is also why one of the reasons why I wrote this book was in a sense not just to speak, not just to sort of like um, put on a different set of glasses for understanding the history of the 20th century, which is what I really think the book kind of is trying to do. I'm not trying to overturn other interpretations as much as I'm trying to show that the rivers were engaged in the same time and place and that they had an influence. Um, but that these kinds of stories are super important for our futures, right? That we tell them to the present in order to be able to reshape the future. And so, thinking through Gilgamesh, thinking through the building of the Kebon Dam, like these two things are, stories of this place and these contexts that hopefully will, point to new directions, ultimately. We historians like to live in the past, but I think we're actually like the kind of work that we're doing is really about the present and the future.
I absolutely concur with you. My last question would be about the salinity and salination. Is that
Mhm.
influencing public discourse and, more importantly, public imagination? Are people visualizing this or thinking about it and crafting new stories of how do we now survive given that this is our material reality?
Hmm. Yes. So the the question of the problem of salt in Iraq is not obviously like something that's only being narrated in this book. I think that you're going to find anytime you start to look, anytime you talk to someone who works as an engineer or who had worked as an engineer or in agriculture in relation to Iraq, whether they're Iraqi or a foreign expert is going to talk about salinization. What hadn't really been done, and I think what this book is really trying to do is show that it's not just a agricultural problem, basically. It's very easily framed as kind of a technical problem of agriculture. We build some drains and we're done. And in fact, that's not. I don't think that's really I think that it sort of gives it sort of short shrift, and also like doesn't really then contend with the broader issues of like happening within the ecology. And of course, like now, as I write in the book, there was a period where Iraq, upon building drains, had a period like somewhat of a respite from the salinization process, but now it's come back in all kinds of ways. Because the water coming down from Turkey is more saline. The water coming up from rising seas is, of course, saline, and the groundwater is now saline. So it's not a new thing. What I would say is that you know it it has it hopefully is, and I think this is happening through really, hopefully this book will I'll add to it, but I think it's happening more through the activities of Iraqis, and Iraqi activists, and this question of sort of what Iraq becomes. This we're in a really interesting period with right now with the Strait of Hormuz being closed, and the United States sort of threatening to cut off Iraq's oil money, which a lot of people don't realize is that all that oil money is held in the United States, and sort of this kind of continued imperial control over Iraq's finances, which is one of the ways that Britain, under the mandate and after controlled Iraq, was through these kind of financial structures. Um, but I think that there's both greater awareness, there's activists who are working. There are actually like kind of really cool small scale things that you can do to work through salinity. But the none part of the problem is that very often we talk about this as Iraq's environmental crisis. Like that's often how it's presented in the media. But and one of the things that the book I think is really trying to point out is that this environmental crisis is not just Iraq. Iraqis like are not fully responsible for like what's going on here. It's very typically told in the press as kind of like, oh, it's war and it's corruption and it's Saddam Hussein, and like that's the story. And instead, what we need to be thinking about is that this is driven partly by a kind of voracious global desire for Iraqi oil. It's created by the brittle ecology of Iraq. That's kind of how I refer to it, as sort of this kind of breakable or brittle kind of situation. Was created through British and American imperial interventions. The system itself was designed by the British. And so it is it's an ecology that already was problematic, that had been made problematic through these engineering works, was constantly kind of being tinkered with and trying to fix it. And then you get all the stuff that people have been writing about in the past 20 years, where you have Turkey still building dams, you have rising temperatures, you have rising seas, you have corruption in the government, you have war. All these things are really driving that. So salinity ends up being, in a sense, in that regard, a a symptom, let's say, of a kind of much broader disease, much of which I wouldn't lay at the feet of Iraq or Iraqis. I think it's much broader than that.
Understood. I am possibly visualizing solutions much the way that the rivers flow through the delta the moment before they meet the sea, that they break into small forks and channels and streams and rivulets
Mhm.
and little brooks and eventually make their way into the ocean. I hope, sincerely hope, that this is how Iraq and Syria and Turkey also find their solutions at grassroots levels instead of one
Yep.
solution that fits everybody, which clearly doesn't.
Right.
We need to learn these lessons from nature. And this thought occurred to me again as part of this conversation. We've been winding and weaving our way through time and space, and now that we're
Mhm.
here toward the end, meeting the delta, Here it is.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for
yeah.
authoring such a fantastic, mind-opening book, Dale. Thank you so much for
Well,
this.
thank you for this conversation. It's wonderful to talk with you about it.
Likewise, thank you so much, and I wish you have a great day and stay safe.
Yeah. Thank you very much. You too.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.